You want to start the recording? All right, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is the last session of the Sailor E-Resources Symposium hosted by the Enoch Pratt Free Library, State Library Resource Center. We are so excited to have you all here. This session title is From Contracts to Evaluation, a conversation about electronic resource management. You are welcome to use the chat during this session to sort of talk amongst yourselves. This whole session is about conversation. And then if you have a question that you want to direct to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. If you've been in other sessions, you've probably seen me. I'm Jody Hoover, the Digital Resources Manager for Enoch Pratt Free Library. And then our session moderator for today is Michael Johnson, who's the Deputy Chief of the State Library Resources Center. And with no further delay, I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Jody. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Made it through 2 days. Made it to the final session. I hope we've got some interesting stuff in conversations for you. Excuse me. And I guess I will ask all of our panelists if you can come on screen and remain muted. But I do want to do some introductions and a little rundown of how we're gonna do the session. As a panel discussion, we've got a set of questions that we really want to run through. I will go through give each of the panelists an opportunity to respond to the question, and then I'd really like a back and forth. The panelists will be able to converse amongst themselves, but if something sparks you from what they say, please do pop it in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that and I'll do the best to jump in and provide those questions as well. When we were conceptualizing this, we don't get a lot of opportunity, I think, to talk to each other, either as colleagues or frontline staff and other library staff, to talk to electronic resource librarians. So do definitely, this is your opportunity to ask any of the questions you had sort of ever kind of wondered to answer. But then I do want to do introductions and thank you all the panelists. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm super glad you all agreed to come on and have this conversation. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on some of these topics. First off, though, we have Amanda Watson. She's the Library Services Administrator for the Eastern Shore Regional Library in Salisbury, Maryland. She's worked in libraries for 18 years in a variety of roles. She holds an MSLIS from Drexel University's College of Computing and Informatics, a BA in Humanities from the University of Maryland, and is a graduate of the Maryland Library Leadership Institute. So welcome, Amanda. Rachael Stein has been working in Maryland libraries since 2007, same as me actually, mostly in digital resources with short detours into correctional libraries and library administration. She is currently the Digital Resources Analyst at Southern Maryland Regional Library Association, where she focuses on digital resources and data visualization. Adam Wall has been with Prince George's County Memorial Library System for over 6 years as their electronic resources librarian, with 13 years of experience in libraries spanning across both academic and public institutions. His interests include creating strong vendor relationships and ensuring ease of access to resources. Accessibility, patron privacy, and fair pricing, yes, fair pricing, are his primary focal points during contract negotiations. And last but certainly not least, Sarah Kuperman. She has worked with electronic resources in various roles at the Enoch Pratt Free Library for over 18 years. She manages the database collection and streaming resources from selection through evaluation. Sarah's role includes reviewing contracts and licensing, managing the renewal process, and analyzing usage reports, which are shared with staff. So thank you all so much for this conversation and agreeing to come on along with us. And with that, I will get started with our first question. This is a little bit of a broader question, and I will start with Rachael, I guess running off. But question one, so some of these can get a little long, but we'll kind of make do. So in order to get our audience like a sense of your jobs and what you do, can each of you talk a little bit about your position and how your organization is kind of set up? I'm curious how the selection, purchase, evaluation of electronic resources is organized within your library, especially in terms of like staffing and responsibilities and things like that. Rachael, if you can start things off.
Sure. I work for the Southern Maryland Regional Library Association. If you are in the central region of the state, you may be less familiar with the regional library system, but my organization provides services to 3 libraries, St. Mary's, Calvert, and Charles counties. And within that, I am responsible for managing the selection, licensing, and evaluation of all of the electronic resources for the 3 libraries that we serve. And I also serve as a liaison between the librarians, the vendors, and our upper management. As part of that, I convene an advisory group that's comprised of 3 staff members from each of our libraries, and we meet twice a year to evaluate our current subscriptions and suggest new products and go over usage. I arrange demos and trials of potential new products for the group throughout the year. And if the group wants to add or drop a subscription, I pass that recommendation on to the CEO and she makes the final decision. The parts of the process that I am not responsible for are marketing and the entire accounting side.
Great, thank you, Rachael. Adam, how about you?
Sure. So I am the only electronic resources librarian at Prince George's County. I am grouped together with the other selectors under the head of materials management. So a lot of the legwork is done by myself, but I will always call in supervisors or staff if I need input or support or just use as a sounding board. So a lot of the legwork is just me doing my best. And then I work closely with other departments like acquisitions and cataloging to make sure that the resources are paid for and they can be found. And I work with like the web developer to make sure that the resources on the website look right and are described properly and everything like that. So it's a lot of like Rachael said, it's a lot of liaisoning with other departments to make sure that all works cohesively. But yeah, that's pretty much where I am in the system.
Sounds good. Thanks, Adam. Sarah, how about you?
My job has changed over the many years I've had it. But right now I sit in the digital resources department and I report to Jody. I basically, if you think about the collection, the e-resources is having a life cycle. I manage things from gathering the ideas that are proposed that may be new resources. I do that. I organize the budget. I read the contracts. I read the renewal invoices, and I manage that process, taking in order to get paid, I create the purchase order. So in order to get paid, I create that purchase order and send it over to acquisitions. And then through evaluation, where I collect all the usage data, I try to analyze it, make it say something, and then pass it along to the various staff members who need it. I also work with, I liaison. I like that word. I liaise with web for a resource placement. I send information to marketing when they ask for it. I work with cataloging and acquisitions like anytime they need me. So that's about where we are now.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And Amanda.
Hi, At the Eastern Shore Regional Library, we're a bit of a small office, but we serve 8 counties. On the Eastern Shore of Maryland, it's Caroline, Dorchester, Kent, Queen Anne, Somerset, Talbot, Wycomico, and Worcester counties. So a lot of what we do, I oversee both the information technology and the information services department. So with the databases directly fall under information services, but I work directly under the administrator for the library. We hold interest groups that involve members of the public libraries. So children's groups, e-groups, anybody that might have a specific interest in some of the databases. So we do get a lot of the feedback initially from their requests and things that they hear about. So those are often the groups that we look to, as we don't make any decision ourselves. It's all based on input from counties. And like Sarah, I very much do a lot of the contract pieces, the life cycle from start to finish. It's just a metric of working with the administrator to make sure that's something we can budget for and make sure it's something that'll get used. And aside from paying the bill itself, that's pretty much it.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, you know, it's like everything is a little the same and a little different. It's all these little small pieces that are all the jobs are a little bit different, though. Thank you. All right, getting into a little of the meat of the questions, and specifically, can you talk a little about, and Adam, we'll start with you. How about this time? Can we talk a little bit about how you determine this is a selection process? What resources are a good fit for your library, including how you discover new resources, how you evaluate them, and sort of who you bring into the conversation through that process?
Yes. So when I first, took the position, my first role was to figure out, like, what does Prince George's County comprise of, like, who are its patrons, who lives here, and who do we serve? So I already have a good idea of who our patrons are and like what they're looking for in general. And then on top of that, I hear from enough patrons, I hear from enough branch staff, and I hear from my supervisors about who is asking for what and like why they're looking for certain information. So when I hear about resources, which is usually through conferences, meetings, vendors directly, and branch staff, I'll have a basic idea of what people are already looking for. And then I'll usually do a demo, and it's usually me, my supervisor, and I will usually handpick a few staff who I know are not overworked and have the skill set and the knowledge and a good critical eye. And then evaluation, especially on new resources, is I personally will think of every reason not to get the resource, and if it makes it through that line of questioning, it usually means that it's made through the initial gauntlet. And that's usually how we kind of do that initial wrangling of what to get and what makes it and what doesn't.
Very interesting. All right, awesome. Thanks, Adam. Amanda, how about you?
Sure. Echoing some of what Adam said, conferences are a big one for me, especially learning of the products that people use outside of our state system. It's always wonderful to talk with the regional groups and, with the Impro groups to know kind of what everyone's demoing, what they're looking at, what they've had good and bad feedback from. But then again, it's talking to people, it's hearing what they're hearing about in their member libraries, if there's school systems that are involved, and hearing the input that some of the teachers provide with the public staff. Those are the biggest pieces. It all comes down to networking and research.
Are you able to you do as far as the demo process and things like that in your area as well?
The demo process we mostly do with the interest group, the e-resources interest group, which is comprised of people that work at the member libraries. They're the focus group, and then they often will share that out with applicable staff that work with, children's departments, reference departments, and things.
Oh, interesting. Yes, you're in a pretty structured environment. That process seems it's got the groups set up. Oh, interesting. Rachel, how about you?
A lot of similarities with Adam and with Amanda. I hear things at conferences through vendors directly reaching out to me about new products that they have. I hear about things through word of mouth. a lot of our librarians are going to the same conferences I am or different ones. And, sometimes there's a certain name of a product that'll bubble up from several people. But also sometimes we're seeking out a particular type of resource. If maybe we've discovered that there's an information need, or we have a particular product where we think maybe the interface is starting to look dated and we'd like to look for an alternative. So sometimes I actually go out looking for products. And yeah, we do demos and trials. And like right now I'm evaluating a couple of potential resources to replace one that we're not as happy with. And so I've made a rubric for my advisory group to evaluate it in several different areas: content, interface, accessibility. And then we put all of that together and make the decision based on our best prediction of whether the features are good enough and whether the usage is going to justify the price.
And Sarah, how about you?
Okay, I think this is fascinating because we're all doing the same thing with some slight differences. Like going out, you'll hear if your staff members are talking about something new, you'll get an ad from the vendor, you'll see it at a conference. I happen to like listservs, urban libraries, and Panelists specifically are really good because something will go by and that's interesting. The MACDAC meetings sometimes bring up things that are of interest. One thing that we do slightly differently, maybe, I'd like everybody's, the panel's feedback on this, is we've started asking for quotes like practically on first contact, because like price isn't everything, but it's a lot. And so rather than go through the process and then find out that this is not sustainable, we've started asking up front. And our vendors are a little surprised by that, but it's working out well on both sides because we have more productive, quicker interactions. Does anybody else do that?
Yeah,
100%.
it's one of those things like, what information do you need from me to get me the price? No, I don't want to like have an hour-long conversation. If it's $1 million, it's not worth it.
Right, exactly. No point spending that time. Yeah.
Rachel,
And in the old days, the vendors did like to talk. They would talk for hours.
Rachel, it sounds like you do the same.
Yeah, and I feel it undermines the library's confidence in me if I ask them to go through an entire evaluation process and then tell them, oh, the price is completely unrealistic for us.
Yeah, I think there's a certain level of transparency. I think, that is, I think, part of a good, healthy relationship. Amanda, would you say that you're in a similar, that you tend to do that in similar situations, or anything different?
Yeah, I think that, the sticker value can be quite shocking for some people, especially as the years go on. And further, like this year, as soon as I started with that methodology of, before we dive into any more information, just give me the cost. What information do you need from me in order to do that cost? And that kind of goes into being transparent with the vendor and finding out what metrics are they actually basing your pricing on.
Oh, yeah, that's another good thing to know.
Yeah, I think, some of it may be that our sense of the sort of the good old days of sort of like haggling. And I sometimes wonder if they were ever really like that. It's while there is that back and forth, but very transparent upfront discussions, I think, seem to work for both sides. Well, very interesting. One question I did have, I think, Rachel, you had mentioned, I think that it was thinking about taking other things into consideration. Do any of you, as you work with both, as you're going to conferences and things like that, does the movements and like the vision of your system, sometimes there are new initiatives and things like that, do you find those come up often when you're seeking out resources? Or, it's like when strategic plans come up and things change? Certainly with COVID, things changed a whole lot. But do you find that comes into your selection process or your kind of survey process? How about Adam? You have any thoughts on that?
Yes, the one thing that comes to mind is a few years ago, maybe like 5 years ago at this point, our new plan, 3-year plan, I forget what they're called, strategic plan came out, and one of them was we wanted to brand ourselves as a business incubator. And so we went out and we got as many, and this is when money was a little bit freer, so we had a little bit more leniency with, kind of spending a little bit here and there. And we wanted to brand ourselves as a business incubator. And so we went and bought what we could. Some of it worked and some of it we don't have anymore.
Anyone else have dealt with anything like that with strategic plans and new initiatives, anything like that?
I think it's certainly a balance. When you have member libraries under you, everyone has a different strategic plan and different things that become important to them, and it doesn't always align with our renewals. So there's definitely midpoints where we start looking into products and things, and there's definitely ones that we've committed to mid-year. One of the latest ones was a collection analysis tool, and while it's not necessarily a traditional database e-resource, it is certainly falls under that category for us. So that was mid-year, and it does vary, and we're happy to support those when they come up.
And Sarah, you raised your hand.
Yes, I'm trying to be quick. There are times like during COVID when we wanted to hit the early literacy and the younger users, and we bought some resources. They didn't work out in the end, but we were glad to have them as something that showed our interest in trying to help. When we look at resources, we know that our library has this focus on African American materials, on Maryland department, and on support for early literacy. It's not the only thing we buy, but we're always looking. If something new were to come up about Maryland, we'd be on it. And African American, the same thing. Also, just recently, we had a big demand for streaming the Baltimore Sun, because we didn't have newspapers in the branches during that COVID ending kind of halftime. So we got press readers specifically because of that need to stream the Baltimore Sun, and press reader has worked out really well for us.
Interesting. All right, let's see. Move on to contract time. Everyone's favorite part of the process. So let's Amanda, let's start with you. So let's talk a little bit about your experiences with contracts. It's like budgets seemingly like always tight. Do you have any insights on how you control costs? We talked a little bit about that process being up front, but it's also you have lots of things like multi-year contracts, bundles, or just plain negotiation. Do you have any tips in your part of your process that have worked well for you?
Well, not all vendors can be treated the same. I've learned many of them operate in different ways. They're licensing words differently. Some you get a very brief, upfront, transparent contract, and others you've got 15 pages to wade through of language specifics. But to save money specifically, I think there's, if you know the vendor and it's a product that you're already familiar with and you're just working for renewals, you have a much easier expectations, I guess, to deal with, and how you can reach that negotiation point, whether that's referring to the budget, looking at multi-year contracts for a product that you already know works. I think brand new, if it's the same company, the overarching parent company, I think you're most of the time dealing with the same reps, so it's easier. But brand new vendors and brand new contracts, you really don't ever know what to expect. And someone made a comment, you can have a very simple, transparent conversation, or you could want someone who wants to have an hour-long chat over a professional conference and kind of schmooze a little bit to be able to find out your needs. So it really varies, but more and more starting to look at those multi-year contracts. And then when Sailor signs on as for certain products, it's always helpful that we get additional discounts with that if we sign on to some of those products.
Thank you, Rachel. How about you?
Well, historically, my organization has stayed away from multi-year contracts, I think because we don't ever know what funding is going to be like in coming years. And I'm wary of bundles because I would rather measure the effectiveness of each resource on its own merits, and it can be difficult to measure that when they're giving you a price break for different resources in a bundle. So I just go back to plain old negotiation. And with some vendors, I've been really successful at just leveling with them and telling them the usage really just doesn't justify the increase that you're asking for. Our budget has not increased to allow for this. And, you know, a lot of times they will be understanding and at least give me a flat renewal price. Some will not. It really, like Amanda is saying, it really varies with the vendor. But with a well-established relationship, a frank conversation can do wonders, I find.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Sarah, how about you?
I find this cost control to be the most complicated thing, and it might be Pratt because of its SLRC status. Perhaps we have a larger collection than most, and after I finish talking, I'd like to know how big are the collections that you manage. We have about 40 resources, and I have in my mind, after working with them, I know where I want their cost per use to fall out. So if they're out of line with that, I start thinking, how am I going to do something here? Recently, we did a 3-year deal in order to keep things from going up 5%. Now they'll only go up 3%. But the things in that deal with that vendor are all kind of core to what we do. They all are things that we couldn't see not having, like the historical Baltimore Sun. We're going to buy that. So by building it that way, I lose flexibility. If somebody were to come and say, cut the budget, well, now I've locked that into place, but I can plan out 3 years and I know what's going to happen. There isn't going to be a sudden jump. And more the big vendors, and the 3 big ones are Gale, EBSCO, and ProQuest, but they're all moving towards being less flexible. So I'm concerned about that. What will it be in the future? For those things that are not in the core, those things that are like, they're doing okay, they're nice, I keep my ear out for alternative products that might be less expensive. And I'm, like Rachel said, the honest conversation, like your user interface is looking old. I don't make that up. That's actually happened to some things. And there aren't that many improvements during the year. We really can't afford to just let the budget creep up. The salespeople hear it all over, and talking about money can sometimes feel awkward because it's not something you do in your everyday life. But with negotiations, that's what's on the table. They're accustomed to it. And you really have to be honest. And you can't always just say, oh, the budget didn't go up, although it's usually true. But you have to, they know that, and they're like, well, sort of. In COVID, we had almost complete cooperation across the board from the vendors. They were flat. They were not asking like, oh, you've got to do this now. They understood. So have a good conversation with them, and even though their circumstances are changing, I think that even the things that they want to do, it used to be they'd like to come like more than once a year and talk forever. I think their processes have modernized, so it's an easier conversation, and both sides are like more into coming to a deal.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Adam, how about your thoughts?
A lot of echoing what was already said. We like for things that we know aren't going away, we will definitely lock in a multi-year contract. And I feel like I didn't get any recently, but I feel like we used to get a discount if we paid that up front, which then theoretically frees up that money for the next 2 to 3 years. But we haven't been getting any discounts on paying up front recently. I don't know why that is. So another advantage that we have is Prince George's County likes to be the first to have things. So because we are usually like the first to have, like, I think Comics Plus was a big one, and a few other products, like we have a really good relationship with them because we are the champions of that product. So that gives us a little bit of a leg up when trying to negotiate, especially during hard times like the pandemic was. And you know, like everyone else said, sometimes they're happy to negotiate, and other times, especially the bigger ones, will say, take it or leave it, and just shrug. And all right. Yeah, I think that's the gist of it. I'm a little bit worried about ProQuest being bought by Clarivate, which is a for-profit publicly traded company, which is a little concerning to me, but this is a different discussion.
Well, and on points of, and some of the, and you, Adam, you had mentioned some of your personal interests. I'd be curious your thoughts, the panel's thoughts on, some of the things like user privacy and data and how that works in contracts, and your experiences working through some of those, the process of particular language, whether it's particular language or for the audience, like the kinds of things you have to go through to pay attention. I think you met with someone, we mentioned that some of them are simple sheets, and then some of them are very long documents and very thorough. Adam, did you have what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I can. So the big one that always sticks out is LinkedIn Learning, when it switched from Lynda to LinkedIn, and LinkedIn was like, congratulations, everyone's now on LinkedIn. And we went, whoa, wait 1 minute. What is happening? And they went, this is how we're doing it. And we went, no, thanks. And we just went without it for a little bit. And then they finally kind of came around a little bit. They swung the pendulum a little bit too hard, if you ask me, but they kind of backed off on the privacy concerns that we had, which was good. And, that's the big one that always sticks out. And other times you especially for big ones like New York Times and Washington Post, you go, all right, I guess I'm getting spam email if I send up for a Washington Post account now. And you just kind of shrug and go, this is the modern world we're in today. So it's a mix.
Great. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Oh, I had wanted to ask everybody how much data is coming into their negotiations with contracts. Like I have a price point, I have a CPU, and cost per use isn't everything, but it is so much. There are other metrics though, like how many programs are staff doing, even if that's not driving the cost per use way down, et cetera, et cetera. But I also love your question about privacy. So I'm going to say something about that. Marketing tools are amazingly invasive, and our customers are somewhat naive about them, because even Pratt Library uses Orange Boy, which tries to be respectful, but I think we need to do more to tell our customers what's going on, because we're not driving that, we're experiencing it too in our private lives. It's impossible to really get yourself off of Google and operate on the internet in any way. So I think that my response to privacy has moved from concern to feeling a little concerned, especially because I'm also encouraging people to get on the internet, to moving toward educate people, because they can figure out how to build their own privacy net. That sounds kind of cruel, but they'll have to do it. So there are two answers, one question. Oh, well.
Thanks, Sarah. Amanda or Rachel, do you have any thoughts on privacy or contract language or anything?
I think it's very important to figure out what the intended word is supposed to mean amongst vendors. In some places, you can just have users and they refer to different things. It could be card holders, or it could be active users. It could be the population that lives somewhere. And I think that's important when you get into language, because especially if you have schools or students or educational institutions that you have partnerships with, that's really important to make sure you understand the vendor and how it assumes the members of your ILS, what they are. When you talk about privacy, I think that's a huge piece, especially for the databases and things that make you create your own accounts. And then, the rule where you have to be, I think it's 13 or 14 to create those accounts. So something like that might be designed for kids, but actually you need to be aware of the privacy implications and how that could affect potential patrons.
Amanda, thank you. Rachel, do you have any thoughts on contract language?
Sure. Well, the biggest pitfall that I've found in contract language is about automatic renewals. So I have actually been burned by this. Certain vendors will put an unreasonably long notice period for renewal in their contract, going up to 90 days, which means if you fail to notify them within 90 days of the end of the contract, you are legally bound to renew. So I always look at that and I ask for no more than 30 days, which seems more reasonable to me. I also look for language that puts the onus of licensing enforcement onto the library, because we only have a certain amount of power in that area. We can make a reasonable effort to inform users of licensing terms and to prevent unauthorized use with requiring barcodes or whatever security measures we have, but we can't monitor users and enforce 100% compliance. So I try to point that out in contracts. We also, though, just have put in place a policy of running any contracts through past our lawyer before we sign them, because as Amanda was saying, there are terms that might mean something different in a legal sense than they do to a casual reader. And I would rather have a lawyer look at that and let us know if we're walking into something bad before we sign.
All those are excellent points. I mean, I think terminology, because a lot of it can mean things in different contexts. Whether it's a user, what exactly is a user, and in what context and where, and all those are important, are really important points to nail down. Thank you. Those are all great points. Let's see, Sarah. We'll start with next question. So this is about, and this is, I think this is the kind of stuff this is a little up your alley, on ongoing evaluation of electronic resources. So, they're electronic resources, they're not all the same. And it's like what a use in one looks very different from a use in another. So what statistics do you track regularly, and how does that play into your decision making? So on the back end evaluation of how a resource has been doing.
Well, I'd love to say I track everything, but I do track everything. We get counter reports, and the panel knows what those are, but the audience might not. That's where we get the number of logins, called sessions, the number of times the search button was hit, and then the number of times a result in a search has been clicked on. It used to be it had to be downloaded, but now it's just click on it and you get a full text retrieval or a citation in some places. And those are the basic categories. For the statewide survey, I figure out what they call the successful retrieval of information, which is they try to identify the best metric for when does our customer reach an end result. And in some, it's the search button, because the results of the search, for example, Emergent Online, the results of the search is a lot of data, and that is what they were looking for. There is nothing more to click on, though you could go to links to other options. But so I look at that, and then when I evaluate it, I keep in mind, okay, there's like, for example, on the sailor level, we had this like drop off in the number of retrievals on ProQuest over just one quarter to the next. But when I look at the sessions, it's the same. So I asked them to be sure their usage report was running, because that seemed really out of whack. So looking at sessions, very frequently sessions doesn't tell you enough to tell you if the product is, if you have successful users. People could be logging on and saying this is useless and leaving. But it will tell you that at least people are still finding it, that the login process isn't shut down, that your link is still working. The problem with sessions is somebody could turn it on and 10 people could use it, and you would know if it was 1, if it was 10, if it's unique user. If we ever go to what's called counter 4 reports, which means all the reports that are counter right now that we basically talk about are 3s. Well, then in the academic world, that got revised and they're up to 5. But if you go out of 3, you start losing sessions even being reported at all, because other academic institutions much prefer retrievals.
Sarah, can you briefly, sorry to interrupt you, for the audience,
I can't be brief.
If you can briefly, what counter is for those who may not.
It's an acronym that I can no longer recite
is
the,
really-
yeah. But if you were one of us, you would see every resource tells you if it's counter compliant, because academic libraries, public libraries, school libraries, we all need to know. We can't watch. It's not like our books. We can see them physically leave. We need to know that these resources are contacting people outside in the internet where we can't watch it all. So those are the things that I track, and making a decision. The basis of the CPU, I always use the successful retrieval. I use that divided with the cost, and then I get my cost per use. And that is a key metric, but it's not the only thing. Some things, as I said, are core. Some things are used in programming. Some things like legal forms, I wouldn't expect that to have the same retrieval rate as the historical Baltimore Sun, which can go as high as 20,000 in a month. So
Thanks,
now-
Sarah.
now I'll
Rachel,
calm
I
down.
saw your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add something about counter compliance. To be certified as counter compliant, they are actually audited by an outside body to make sure that they're reporting things accurately. And that's a nice thing about counter stats. You can trust them as much as we can trust any data.
Oh, great. Thank you, Rachel. Amanda, your thoughts?
I definitely think the state statistics and what's required there certainly drives some of the statistics we look at and report back. There's some that are obviously we need to have the total retrievals, but there's others, like Sarah mentioned, that, you know, if they're used in a program session can be helpful that way. But again, it doesn't always capture the true value perhaps of what is being used. For instance, we have low session usage consistently for a crafting database, but anecdotally, you hear wonderful stories about how many people attended that program where that resource was utilized. So I think it's balancing out, you know, the collections of stories and narratives that you're getting from people along with the data. And if they're counter compliant, that's one of the things we look for. But there's also products that we work with that we know aren't counter compliant. And then, you know, we have to balance that out. And occasionally every vendor will have errors in their reporting, and we'll get an email a month later saying, here's your corrected statistics. So.
Definitely. Thanks, Amanda. Adam, how about you?
So like everyone else, I personally prefer full text retrievals, but then we're getting into like these new streaming services, which is really cool. And I tend to look at I'll look at views, and for things like Freegal, which is a music platform, I'll look at how many songs were streamed, how many songs were downloaded. But then like you run into like interesting things where you're like, oh, like the cost per use is really low. And then you look at how many people are using it, and it's just like a lot of power users. So like it's getting used a lot, but also like there's not many people using it in the grand scheme of things. So you get into like some really interesting discussions of like, is this worth it or not? Like, so yeah, so that's the data that we track is, you know, the recommended ones, but like occasionally you'll get some resources. I think Amanda said it like where they'll just give you sessions and you're like, all right, I guess this is it. And you know, you just do the best with what you have. But as far as statistics go, anytime anything is on the chopping block or something doesn't look right, you always have to look at all of the stats together to get that like full picture, because one stat does not tell a full story.
Right. You know, and some of the things I think you all are mentioning too is that, you know, all statistics it can be so nebulous. It can mean, you know, one thing can mean one thing and then another, and you take all this into context. And then there are just errors in reporting and things like that. And it makes me think that how important relationships are with not only, you know, with the vendors, you know, with your contacts to keep those, to keep a solid relationship with it. So any variances and things like that can be worked out, because we've got information on our end, and then they have information on their end, and working cohesively with that is really helpful. Sarah.
One of the things as I grow into using data and over the many years, one of the sentences I came across was, the enemy of good data is perfect data, because if you were really trying to find that perfect number, it doesn't exist. And when I worked on selection team with even with something that seems as straightforward as the number of times a book circulated, well, yeah, you get that number, but then when you try and make it part of the story of the evaluation process, it becomes fuzzy. And so now I will take a fuzzy picture over no picture, but always keep an open mind about what is the data telling you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. All right, let's see. And just again, a reminder, if anyone in the audience has questions, you can pop them in the Q&A. We can get to them directly. We'll also can save some time at the end as well. Next question, let's see. So this was something that came in prior to the during registration. Someone was interested in what reasons do you give the public when you discontinue a resource? And how do you communicate that discontinuation to public and staff and even leaders? I think can be, depending on who you talk to, there are different kinds of things ways you have to communicate things. Specifically, starting with how you communicate it to the public, though. Rachel, how about you?
Well, fortunately, I do have a marketing team that helps me with that kind of messaging. So when we know that we're going to discontinue something, I generally turn it over to the marketing folks, and they craft those messages and send them out in their various newsletters and on the website. We do put messages on the website as early as we can and try to keep as positive a tone as we can about it. And another fortunate thing, I think anything that we have discontinued without replacing it with another comparable product has been because usage is very low. And so I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of complaints about that from the public, and there haven't been.
A good point. Adam, how about you?
Well, if we're really lucky, it's not our fault. To take a recent example, The Economist recently changed the way they let libraries subscribe. And so Overdrive, who we get The Economist from, stopped having it in the thing. So we were able to just be like, we're losing this. And so all these are usually, if it's big enough, like when we lost LinkedIn Learning for a bit, we emailed every card holder because it was a big enough resource. For The Economist, we put it on Overdrive. We bumped up our magazine list, and then in the description we put, The Economist is going away starting March 1st or end of February, however it's phrased, or maybe end of January, whenever it is. And so, and I would just echo what Rachel said, is usually if it's getting cut, there's like not that many users. So we message, if we can get a generated list of card holders that have accessed it in the last like 6 months, we'll send out through Orange Boy, our communication service, we'll send out a targeted message that says, hey, looks like you may have used this, it's going away. Here's some alternatives, if there's alternatives, and go from it like that. But ideally it's something that, the publisher, the distributor, the vendor just doesn't offer anymore. We can just go, we share your concern, we're looking for alternatives, but it wasn't us. It wasn't like it wasn't our decision to take it away from you.
Right. Thanks, Adam. Amanda?
As far as marketing, with us being a regional library, we don't interface with the public directly. So a lot of that preemptive messaging, if something's on the horizon, is communicated directly to the libraries or their special interest groups. So we kind of look out there. I don't mean to put that on anyone else, but again, echoing some of the same things, it's usually because something's not being utilized. So you're only hitting that small portion of people who perhaps used it. And the one thing I always like to remind people is, you can have a database, but it doesn't actually substitute for a reference interview. So there's a lot of times where you can get the customer what they need and want, as long as the right questions are being raised and the right tools and knowledge is there.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Sarah?
Pratt's in the same situation. Our department doesn't have to write the message. We have to tell marketing. Marketing's message back to us is to get out in front of it and be positive and try and have an alternative. Although sometimes there isn't an alternative. I thought we were very lucky when you and I had to go through some things and make some cuts because of the budget change. And we were very lucky there that we could take the popular things and make them narrower. Like we had a package from Gail that we could trim out some things that were lesser missed, they were lesser used. And we were able to continue the title itself in a smaller sort of footprint, for lack of a better term. So we have been lucky that we only cancel things that really weren't used, and that was fun.
Yeah, and working with vendors, that kind of thing is really helpful when
Definitely.
you have good partners to go back and forth with. I think though, and a couple of you touched on a little bit. We got an interesting question from a member of the audience, and I think it goes to public service staff versus and not versus, I shouldn't say that, public service staff and how relationships with sort of behind the scenes. So they're asking, when you have to consider canceling a resource, do any of you offer staff who do reference service the option to offer feedback of the potential impact? And if so, how? How about we start with Adam? I think you mentioned you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so no, we have enough people who do, like, we don't have subject specialists anymore. So everyone theoretically should be doing reference interviews. And so we don't have the availability to reach out to every librarian and say, give me your feedback. So we will usually announce when considering, starting from the beginning, when we start considering it, I usually will, again, opposite of getting a resource, I will handpick certain people and say, tell me about your experience with this. Tell me, like, who's the last person that asked for it? When's the last time you looked for it? Do you even know we have it? And then I'll go from there. So usually if we cancel something, it is in the weekly management update with, here's why we canceled it. Here's what we're doing. Here's the alternatives. Here's what you can do. If you have any questions, please email me. And it's a discussion, unfortunately, after it's already been canceled, of like, how do you address this during reference interviews?
Gotcha. Thanks, Adam. Sarah, I think we're in a bit of maybe a fortunate instance with, we do have subject specialists here at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Can you talk a little bit about how, and it doesn't always work perfectly, but some of the opportunities we have.
Yeah, it doesn't always work perfectly. And in the first discussion of it, we know the key people in the key departments. Remember, I'm thinking, because I'm looking at you, I'm thinking, oh, remember when we went over and talked to, but it's true that the team that was faced with the really, unfortunately, it's a kind of a crisis thing. It's never good news to walk up to a subject specialist and say, well, this thing you use, maybe not. But those discussions keep us on track and help us get the word out ahead of time if we have to cut something. So far, well, there are things like with BST, there are some business resources that they run toward the high side on the CPU. And I'm always like, well, I talked to you, I talked to Jody, and like, but we're keeping it because they do programming. And they're involved in programming even with the county, meaning Baltimore County in this case. So that ongoing discussion alerts the staff that they need to try and do something to maybe use it a little bit more. Not a high pressure thing, but if you're going to want this, use it. And I think that we have a good relationship there. So it's nice to have out there public service staff.
Amanda, you have any particular thoughts on that?
We're smaller, obviously, than a lot of the places, but even still, it'd be impossible to talk to every person who has feedback from providing reference. I think the concrete examples, if you can have those conversations with folks and finding out what the particulars were that they couldn't locate, it opens up so many different avenues, whether that's an alternative source, maybe it's just techniques and troubleshooting on how to do different types of searches on the open web, or it's different training opportunities to bring in folks from the member libraries. But I think the communication is key, because we we can't talk to everyone. So we have to rely specifically on those, the dedicated members of those interest groups that are chosen by their library's leadership in order to communicate back those conversations that have hopefully already taken place with the other staff members.
Gotcha. Thanks, Amanda. Rachel?
I have a very similar situation to Amanda where my database advisory team really serves as a hub of communication between my organization and the public service staff. So I hope they represent not just people doing digital resources and collection development out in the libraries, but also public service staff themselves, including children's, because like youth services people really need to be in the conversation when we're talking about a lot of these resources. And so I try to give as much notice as I can if something is looking like it's not being used enough to justify the cost, so that marketing can take a try at remedying the situation, so that reference and youth services people will have a heads up that they might need to start looking at alternatives. So yeah, it's just a matter of those open conversations like all of you were saying.
Yeah, I think and that can be, systems large and small. It can be a challenge to make those connections. But I agree. It is super important. We are getting super close on our end of our time. If there are any questions from the audience, please do pop them in the Q&A. I did have I think a final question is a bit broad, and we can kind of all. Oh, Jody, you popped on there. One, I think, final question before we head off is briefly sort of your thoughts on a lot of different resources. The balance between print and electronics been changing so much of the year through the years. Is there a way to? I'm sorry, maybe not enough time to really do it, but to where you see things going in the coming years as things have shifted so much to electronic resources. Rachel?
From the feedback that I'm hearing from the libraries, I think there's certain resources that people are always going to want in print. I hear, and I've been hearing for years, that test prep books, people really want the physical book. So we had trouble marketing Peterson's test and career prep when we were paying for it on our own because of that. I think it will continue to move more and more digital, but not in the traditional periodical database format, more in the interactive web-like format that people are used to everywhere else.
Thanks, Adam. And if we have to end this, Jody, just give me an eye. I know I shouldn't have asked that last question.
All right, real quick. I don't think print's going anywhere anytime soon. I can imagine a future far, far the distant future where print goes away, but it's not anytime soon.
Awesome. Amanda, as quick as Adam did.
Same thing with print, but I think the bigger argument is streaming versus databases and giving up our flexibility there, being willing to get rid of more regular traditional databases in lieu of streaming resources and that web interface that Rachel mentioned.
Absolutely interesting. So true. Sarah?
I think open access is going to kill the periodical index, and streaming is the way to go. And the physical book will still exist. We still have candles. We just don't use them for everything.
Thank you all so much. I do appreciate it. There's a lot of info, a lot of details. To hope for the audience to give us a little bit of a view into all of the details that go into electronic resource management and how much there is to think about. So thank you, Adam, Amanda, Rachel, and Sarah. Definitely thank you so much for participating. And Jody, I'll turn it over to you.
So thanks to everybody for this session. This was a great wrap up to our Sailor Symposium. For those of you that are still on, be on the lookout. We'll send emails for the feedback form, for the CE forms, all of the conference recordings, all of those things will be forthcoming. So look for those in your email. Thanks to all for a wonderful Sailor Symposium this year. It has been great, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all.